So I've been drawing portraits for a long time. I think I've always been interested in the human form. A lot of the drawings I've done are, of course, abstract as well, but bringing that abstraction into the human form I think is the most interesting combination to me. And this is kind of a very traditional, like, forward-facing portrait, and finding the symmetry and then bringing all these different textures in to add to the and create some like asymmetry is, I think, also an interesting aspect too. Trying to balance that is interesting with something that is kind of so perfect as much as this reference photo was. And I think the familiarity of the human form is makes it very easy to have a conversation with the viewer, with someone that's consuming the image. I think from an artistic standpoint, that's also fascinating because really it feels like what I'm creating or what I'm working on will eventually become kind of a visual conversation for the viewer. I kind of think of anyway art as that in that sense. So having certain subjects or certain concepts or having the structure of something be familiar to someone is what kind of makes that important. It kind of adds to that experience of consumption. Maybe consumption isn't the exact word, but I kind of think of it that way when I'm drawing. And I do start these drawings with a reference. You can see the kind of pencil and like line work the rough kind of layout before I go in with ink. I kind of work that way now because as fun as it is to kind of freehand something, it seems like having that structure ahead of time is always helpful. So I'll just sketch it out now. I used to freehand it with just pen and ink, but making sure that the ratios are correct and then branching out from there is now very, very important. And there is kind of a point at which the reference isn't as important anymore, but for the first kind of portion of the drawing, I'm thinking about what I am trying to represent and paying attention to the way that kind of light and shadow is working within the form or within the figure, and then not holding back on any of the kind of specific lines that then determine what those values and what those forms end up being like. That's an important aspect for sure. So kind of what that means would be that whether the line is sporadic, whether it's cross hatching, whether it's just straight kind of thick ink shading, it has to kind of represent somewhat some part of that value or that form. And then once like the basic kind of necessities are kind of involved, once those things are accomplished, then the rest becomes kind of an outgrowth of that. It can become anything at that point, which I think is the exciting part. There's obviously a lot of fragmentation that takes place. I don't think of it as like while I'm creating each piece, I'm not necessarily thinking of it as building things up using smaller forms or smaller pieces, but I think that is kind of what ends up happening in the end. It turns out to kind of look like this amalgamation of smaller forms and fragments all kind of put together and adjusted and added in place. I think that comes from outlining some of these pieces and some of the shaded areas when I create a value through cross hatching or through different pieces of line work, and then outline that area. It takes on the form of almost like a puzzle piece. There's a lot of decision making taking place. Obviously, there's deciding whether to harshly shade an area or not is connected to reference, but then also the way of the bounce that needs to take, the balancing of all the pieces already involved, what came before, is, I think, needs to be included in some form. So whether something gets finished or heavily shaded or, kind of completed in a certain way is very much based on what's next to it, what's happening on other parts of the face. So usually it probably is about, I don't know, somewhere like 40 or 50% of the way through that I'm no longer really referencing the photo anymore. I'm not taking too heavily from it. I kind of have an idea of where things are, and then I can kind of veer off into whatever direction feels most natural. And there's quite a few of these drawings that I've done that are overworked, and I think they're kind of beautiful in their own way, but they do look very busy. And so you kind of want to be careful of that, and you want to allow for space. You want to allow for, what some of the empty spaces end up being because light is being showcased in those areas of the face. But other areas, like I mentioned, are kind of left unfinished and uncompleted just because it's good to have that space. It's almost like a break from the visual aspect of it. There is so much going on in some of the little tiny areas, and they can kind of be chaotic, but altogether, stepping backwards, it's supposed to be part of a whole. Every new mark very much makes the image more specific and stands out from the last mark or the last drawing that I had done. And so, yes, the drawings are starting to, I feel like they're starting to not be as separated from the paintings that I've done. I think I'm starting to bridge a gap between the paintings and the drawings, which is exciting because I think I'm starting to think about paint in the way that I'm thinking about line work. And when enough of these marks, enough of kind of these lines are added together and they kind of form what feels like maybe the essence of an expression, or almost the essence of the contrast within the expression. I think it's probably a little bit, I think of the work as doing something other than portraying the person in the photograph. The photograph is very much like a starting point. It's kind of like the foundation of a home or something. It has relation to the entire structure of the home, but it doesn't necessarily determine exactly how the rest of the home will look in the end. The photograph does reflect something of the person or the photograph, but it's not meant to maybe capture their essence in particular. It's supposed to, I think a lot of drawings can be like this too. It's supposed to represent some other form of that essence, some other kind of level of that essence, I suppose. And I think the more kind of variety you have within these shaded forms or within these values that create the portrait, I think that it kind of forces the viewer to do a little bit of work, a little bit of searching, because you kind of are, even though it's very much obviously a portrait, a face, there's a lot happening in other areas around it. So there's the recognizable part, and then there's the areas that we're not really seeing clearly. So the viewer kind of has to do a little bit of work to find the bounce themselves. At least that's what I'm seeing. That's what it seems like to me. So if there is some aspect of the drawing that isn't fully resolved, I feel like that's kind of the goal. That's kind of what I think makes the piece more interesting. There's all these other visual components that have to work along with that. There has to be balance. Composition has to allow for things to flow properly. But as long as that there's a little bit of space left for the viewer to insert themselves into that piece, I think that's an accomplishment. But that bounce is endlessly fascinating, so that's kind of what I'm usually looking for.